good evening, everybody. Welcome to the first Wednesday night Faith Formation Zoom in Lent of 2021. We're doing a series this Lent corresponding to the themes of the Sanctuary for Lent 2021, the devotional that Knollwood households received in the mail. And we are just exploring the themes of the devotional in lots of different directions, but we're focusing on people's stories and how their family stories and personal stories, vocational stories relate to these themes and to these scriptures. So taking this Lent to learn more about us as a congregation and how we relate to these themes. So the theme for this evening is covenant. Covenant shows up right away in the Hebrew Bible. In fact, in divinity school, we had a joke that whether it was a multiple choice question or an essay question, covenant was usually a good answer to begin with. If you didn't quite understand, just start riffing on covenant and you probably were getting somewhere close to the truth. But in Genesis 9, right after the creation is destroyed and then renewed with the flood, God makes a promise saying, I'm now setting up my covenant with you, and puts a rainbow in the sky to symbolize the covenant that, particularly from then on, after the primordial waters of baptism of the flood, after that cleansing, God would be our God, and we as God's people would be God's people. And that was the promise and the foundation of faith forevermore. So that's just the basics of covenant from a biblical perspective. And throughout the history of Israel and throughout the history of the Christian church, we have identified ourselves as God's people. God is our God and we are God's people, and we belong to each other. We belong to God, and God belongs to us. But covenant is also realized in our human relationships. Friends belong to one another. Family members belong to one another. Faith community members belong to one another. So I wanted to ask these two wonderful Knollwood families, the Stinehelfers and the Joyces, to spend some time with us this evening reflecting on covenant, how they understand it from their faith perspective, and also how they understand the meaning of covenant as two families who have fostered children and also adopted children. And as a larger Knollwood family, we know the children that they have fostered and adopted now. It's our privilege to have them as part of our larger faith family as well. So I wanted to invite them to the Zoom to reflect on covenant. What does it mean to belong to God, and what does it mean to belong to a family? Let's begin our time together with a brief prayer. This prayer is actually called the Covenant Prayer. It was written by John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, and it was written to begin the new year and to reaffirm one's baptism. But I'll use it to begin our time together this evening. Let us pray. I am no longer my own, but yours. Put me to what you will. Align me with whom you will. Put me to doing. Put me to suffering. Let me be employed for you, or laid aside for you, exalted for you, or brought low for you. Let me be full. Let me be empty. Let me have all things. Let me have nothing. I freely and wholeheartedly yield all things. And now, glorious and blessed Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, you are mine and I am yours. So be it. And the covenant now made on earth, let it be ratified in heaven. Amen. Well, I've already mentioned our two families, the Stinehelfers and the Joyces, and I just want to give them a couple of minutes to introduce themselves, just super simply and briefly. Just who are the members of your family, and maybe just maybe how long you've been at Knollwood. So, Rachel, would you go first?
Sure. Danny and I have 4 children. Henry is 16, Claudia is 14, Walter's 11, and Jameson is soon to be 4. And y'all all know this because we know all of you here, but the oldest 3 are biological children, and we adopted Jameson through foster care. We've been going to Knollwood since we moved back to Winston-Salem right before Walter was born, so almost 12 years. And my mother is Judith Kuhn, and so I came with her and my grandmother, who was a member for years, like for holidays when we would come home. When I was living in Durham. So
thank you. We're really, really glad to have y'all. Thanks for being willing.
Sure.
I'm Marissa Joyce, and this is my husband Daniel. He's en route. Colton just got his red belt in Taekwondo, and testing was running a little bit behind, so they're on their way back. And if you hear any booms or have heard any booms or shouting in the background, Lydia and Jalen are playing unattended while I'm on this Zoom. So yeah, best of luck to that. So we've got Colton, Lydia, and Jalen. Colton's 9, Jalen's 8, Lydia's 7. And we started at Knollwood right after Jalen's placement with us in foster care. And then we joined, I guess that was in the fall, and we joined the next spring. So we've been members about 2 years now.
Wow.
I still feel new.
Yeah.
It's been a long time. I'm a deacon. I still feel new.
Relative.
Right.
Y'all became part of Knollwood's fabric really quickly. So in some ways you feel new, and in some ways it feels like you've been part of Knollwood for a long, long time.
Mhm.
I agree with that.
So super glad to have y'all. And yeah, so I have some questions to ask these two families, and I'll alternate between them, but I'll ask Marissa first. Tell me a little bit about your sense of covenant as a person of faith. How would you talk about how you see covenant between God and God's people?
Sure. That is a big question. And I think, honestly, covenant to me, Daniel's walking in. Hi, Daniel. Covenant feels like the baseline the baseline promise that we all kind of view the world through and operate through. I don't know about you guys, but I just have this expectation in my bones that things are supposed to be just, and people are supposed to act loving, and the world is supposed to work right. And when it doesn't, it's always a surprise. It's always kind of feels like, it's a betrayal. It's a shock to me. And I think that that's the seeds of Eden in us. We're born with this expectation of the world operating according to God's nature. And when it doesn't, that feels foreign and broken and not right. And I think that that's partly because we're created in God's image. We're created with that heartbeat of the covenant within us. And now as redeemed people, we're carrying that covenant forward. God promised us, we can act according to that promise, but his word remains true. But for those of us who are kingdom people, we're building that just kingdom here. and keeping our covenant, our part of the covenant to God to help create the Eden that we've left, recreate it here.
Thank you for that. Daniel, I know you just walked in.
I'm gonna move this down a little so you can actually see my face.
On
I'm
a
in a little tiny.
child's chair.
Well, you didn't have a chair for me.
I'm sorry. I thought you were.
This
Well,
is your office.
Okay. Sorry.
It's great to see you, Daniel. It's all good. As long as the family is right there together, it's all good. But yeah, I know you just walked in, Daniel, but anything that comes to your mind when you think about covenant and just what it means to you as a person of faith, how do you think about the covenant between God and God's people?
That's a really good question. And it's a lot. I mean, what Marissa said is probably better than I'll say, so I'll just add a little bit. It's a lot of things that we want things to be fair. We want things to be just. We want God to set that up in the world. That doesn't mean we're always going to think that it's fair and just in the moment. But when we look at the big picture and we see God moving in our lives, we see the fairness and justice.
So covenant has that, the promise really has to do with justice and fairness, as well as belonging to. Well, Rachel and Danny, what are some of y'all's thoughts on covenant? Just how have you grown up thinking about covenant? How do you think about it now?
Well, yeah, of course, the first thing that jumped to my mind too was, as you alluded to, the Genesis, the rainbow covenant is the one that I was first introduced to as a child in church. And so that kind of, and I think there are some corollaries there to the fostering journey also, that sometimes difficult with the difficult times, like, and then the promise of a better day, there's some of that in there, and that symbolism, I think, and that the journey is sometimes very difficult, and but that covenant is that the God is there watching, and bringing, in my mind, maybe guiding that, bringing things into that child's life, and along the way, and to make it a little more cheerful and sunny.
Wow. Yeah.
Actually, the concept of covenant seems very foreign to me. Like, this isn't language that makes sense to me at all. And Marissa and I had a text about it, because I'm like, Catherine wants me to start this conversation. This seems like a bad idea, because I don't really understand that word. Like, that's just not been a regular part of that word. Is not a thread in my Christianity and in my faith growing up. A promise by God, and just that sort of maybe lay person language is more familiar to me, and kind of something that, again, I know we're already framing this for fostering, so I've probably got that more of a lens on it right now. But I know that whenever I go through like thoughts of like, where is God in this situation? Like, I don't think God's here. And I know I've asked Diane Lipset, especially when we went through training and kind of opening our eyes to what children are exposed to, what they go through. And she said, God is in the response. And so that to me is something that kind of is the promise to me, is the response of God's people to the hardship and to the bad times. And so that's what I guess I hold the covenant as a responsibility in myself.
Wow. Yeah. The promise is in the response. Like the promise, the covenant, the fulfillment of the covenant is in how we respond to that suffering. Yeah. Well, thanks, y'all. Thank you for just tackling the big theological question just right off the bat. Let's ask a little bit about your stories. So for the Joyces, if you would just tell us basically, how did you come to foster Jalen and then adopt? Just whatever you would like to share about your particular journey, and how how covenant relates with that.
I'll start. So I thought when we had our 2 biological children that we were finished having grown family. And I was all excited. And I used to be on Facebook and I'm not anymore. And I put on Facebook, I was like, our family's finally complete, like from the hospital. And just felt like that was great. 2 kids I could handle. I mean, I couldn't really handle, but I could do okay. We got into a groove. We had a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, and I was like, we got one in kindergarten. It's time for smooth sailing. Like, we're finally getting some peace. And Marissa was like, yeah, I really feel like we should adopt a child. And I was like, do you now? and I kind of, we had talked about it, and I kind of thought in the future, after our biological children are grown and maybe out of the house, adopting an older child, like a teenager or something. Just, I looked at it almost like it's just a short thing, like just grab a teenager for a couple of years. It was very immature and not the correct way to look at being a parent at all. And so when she brought it up, and I was like, yeah, in the future, which was a lot of the conversation we had about having biological children.
Everything.
I was always like, yeah, 5 years, and it would never get less than 5 years. It was always 5 years from now, 5 years from. So she kept bringing it up, and I was like, well, I mean, we can talk about it and I'll think about it. And one day it just felt right. Like, I don't know I don't think my brain doesn't really work in stages of getting towards something. It just kind of goes 0 and then to 60 or whatever. Like, it's off and then on. So one day it just clicked, and I was like, yes, I'm ready. I'm ready to sign up and do it. And we, after that, moved quickly, and applied. And then it took a while for our license to come through. It felt like it wasn't as long as some, longer than some, I guess. And then we were licensed for like a day, maybe a week. It was not very long. And they were like, we got this boy, he's 5. And I was like, okay, well, there we go. Okay, send him on. And that was Jalen. And 2 days later, he lived in our house, and we haven't turned back. So everything just kind of was step, and it happened. And we learned more about Jalen and about him being part of our family, and what it means to have a 5-year-old come into your family who has lots and lots of words to put behind all of the feelings that you have when you start out in a family. Because our biological children had cry, so they didn't tell you, I want to be in a different family, even though their cries kind of told them. He would say, when do I go to my new family? Because you guys told me I wasn't allowed to have that second cupcake or something. And he would just,
I'm ready for my new family.
yeah, he was like, you're mean, I don't like you anymore. And so that was months of, whenever he would get mad, that's what he would say. And it took a lot of effort, and I'm not the most patient person. And so it was a challenge to not snap at him. Aren't you appreciative of all you have from me, sir? And in our class, they prepared us for that. They said, look, kids are kids, and kids expect what they expect. They don't, just like our own biological children. It's not that they're just like, oh, thank you so much for the cereal for breakfast. It's so nice that you prepared it. Like, that's just not how it works. And so why would we expect a foster child that you were going to adopt to be any different than regular kids? So that was a definite journey. And I think that choosing, even though, I mean, it wasn't like we chose him, like we didn't walk to the store and pick out a kid, or, I mean, that sounds bad, but it wasn't like that. But we chose a different way to have a child, and it does to me feel different. I think some of that will fade, but honestly, it does feel a little different sometimes. And so I don't know, I rambled, but that's kind of the journey that we're on, and we haven't stopped. We adopted him about 11 months ago, and the journey is still ongoing because he's still adjusting to living in our family. He's not lived with us for longer than he's lived with us, so there's still a lot that's going on. And even when he's lived with us longer than not living with us, it'll still be, he's he has other experiences that we don't know anything about. Because even though he was 5 and he could talk a little bit, we don't really know what happened in this previous life that he had. So
Yeah, I'll just add, I mean, Daniel and I both lost a parent relatively early in life. So we kind of know that feeling of loss, loss of a sense of family, loss of a sense of home, loss of a sense of establishment, and how everything changes, which I think was part of our hunger and motivation for providing that stability and that sense of rootedness for a child who had similar losses. I do need to clear up the record and say that we had talked about adopting even when we were dating. I didn't just spring it on him.
that's fair.
And I prayed about it. I remember saying to you, I said, we've talked about adopting someday. I feel like that day is now. I'm just going to ask you to pray about it, and then I'm never going to bring it up again, and you just let me know if you're ready, because I didn't want to push you into it. So I didn't just say, hey, this is our next thing we're doing.
Everybody's got 2 sides of the story.
I mean, I did that with the first 2 kids, but not with this one. And also, we were Jalen's 8th family. He was in the system for 2 years, and we were his 8th placement. So, the saying, I'm ready for my next family, it really tore you apart, because it was what he knew. He was 5 years old and we were number 8. And like the fact that seemed normal to him just still feels heartbreaking. So we were glad to be able to keep a covenant that no matter how he felt about us, we were going to remain consistent for him.
Wow, that's powerful. That he can say whatever he is just going to say or do as a child, and y'all are the ones keeping that covenant. At this point, in terms of thinking about belonging, like y'all belonging to him and him belonging to you, does it feel that way in your family now after 11 months? Does it feel like he belongs to you and your family? And do you get the sense that he feels like he belongs?
Frankly, I think the pandemic helped a lot. We just spent the last 11 months with each other basically 24/7. And, before that, there was a lot of scurrying around, going to school, going to church, going to Taekwondo and counseling and stuff. And, that's normal life, but having this past period of time to just truly be together in, day out, no other distractions, I think has really solidified us as a family unit. I mean, today was rough, but I have rough days with all of my kids, it just happens.
And your husband too.
Oh, bless. Yeah. Never a rough day, 15 years. So yeah, he feels like family, but he has a history that we don't know. And that history comes out sometimes. And that doesn't make him feel foreign or not ours, but it's something that you have to hold space for. I mean, there's just loss and adoption, period. Mm-hmm. He's had loss, and we can't fully understand or walk alongside that because there's stuff that we don't know. Wow. And he was too young to be able to put it into words.
Yeah, I think just because we belong to each other doesn't mean it's going to be harmonious. Yeah. That's not part of the promise, right? Yeah. Thank y'all so much for sharing that. I'll ask the Stinehelfers now a similar question. If you could just share with us some of your story of fostering and adopting Jameson.
Sure. He has the same story Daniel has to start off with.
Similar. I mean,
this was all of Rachel's idea.
It would be interesting to poll the people there to see who initiated which member. Was it the
right
mom or the dad? No. But it's something that we had also. I don't. Do you want to explain
Yeah.
that part or not?
We had, when we first got married, we thought we wanted to have 5 children. That was what we had said. And after 3, I thought, I am not as good at this as I thought that I was. So this is stressing me out. So we stopped at 3, and then I got older. And by the time I realized I wanted more children, it wasn't really feasibly possible for us. And so thinking about how to deal with that, there was a lot of mourning for me about our family ending. I didn't want that to happen. And so it was like, I called Children's Home Society about adoption, and I went to several different places, and then I would stop. Like I would go and find out, and then I would stop because I got really worried. And I even sat in on a fostering one and just thought, I can't do that. I can't give them back, and I can't take them to visits when I know the parents have been neglectful, and I just can't be a part of that. And then it just kept gnawing at me that's what
Here come the little footsteps right here too. But yeah, it was a period of many years too, as part
to come to that conclusion that that's how we wanted to grow our family. And it was actually on the summer trip when we were in Germany, and we spent part of a day with a little girl who was a friend of a friend, and she was little, and Walter and Claudia just like took care of her and just loved on her. And I wanted to like eat her with a spoon, and she was so cute, and she was like 2 years old. And I was like, oh yeah, I need to do this. I may take the baby with me. So I think we probably need to look at having more children. So we did end up with the foster direction, and I'm really glad that we did. I mean, it opened my eyes a lot to how many children are in the system, and sort of my advocacy piece of my heart and spirit really came out for these kids. And so we got Jameson actually as a respite placement. And I should say Marissa and Daniel and Danny and I were in the same fostering class at Children's Home Society. That's how we met. And so they got our license, we got a little bit later than they did. So we kind of had mirrored experiences through it, and we got a call about, and I also had some heartbreak in there that is like, you get a call and you're like, yes, and then they never call you back because they found another family to take the child. And I had no idea that would happen. I figured you said, yes, they're going to show up at your front door with this kid, but they're calling a whole bunch of other places, and maybe something is closer to the child's, school that they're going to, or whatever, all these things. So I had times that I was just like, we're going to get this kid and we're going to do this. And then I found out we didn't. And I was just, like comparing it to miscarriages is pretty extreme, but it was like, I had this hope for this kid to come live with us, and then it didn't happen. And it was just crushing. And so when we got the call for Jameson, it was for a 3-week placement was what we had heard, because he was living with his aunt as his foster home, and it was for 3 weeks. I'm like, this is great. We'll figure out if we're any good at this, if it's a good fit or whatever. And so y'all see what happened. He was there for 3 weeks, or 2 weeks actually. They ended it sooner, went back to her, and then she said, I can't do this anymore. And his social worker called and said, I know you said that he really fit into your family. Would you want to be his foster family? And I just like tears. I was a dermatologist with Henry, and I'm like sobbing. I'm so excited to get him. And I felt, he was little. I just like held on to that baby, and I just felt like I was his mother so early on in the process. And there's just a lot of also care for a child that size, of bonding and holding and all of that. And so there were a couple times that we thought that he was going to go possibly somewhere else. And I just grieved. Even with him in the house, I was just grieving. Is that a sausage? Yeah. Can you say hey to everybody?
Yeah.
Here, he just picked
I was
up
a little more
a
reluctant.
bratwurst on the counter and is eating it with his hands. So we run a tight ship around here. Yeah, so go ahead.
No, I didn't want to set myself up. So, I didn't get quite as attached as early on, kind of intentionally. Someone intentionally put a little distance because it was a respite placement at first. And, but no, I could definitely see that Rachel had, even in that 2-week period. And so I thought, oh boy, it worked out very nicely, but
Yeah.
this-
And also back to sort of the covenant promise. And what I would say is that I feel like we've made that same promise to him. I like the way that that Daniel was saying, and just the promise that we have to always be his parents. And what's interesting though is that I sort of made a covenant promise to his biological mother and his biological aunts that we would keep him in their lives also, which is, I feel fortunate to be able to make that covenant with them. But I think that they weren't sure if they could trust me, and so to let them know that I think it's good for everybody because of the loss that's there. And when you can maintain some communication with them, it kind of furthers my own personal mission in this too, that I can give some joy in where there is just so much loss for his biological mother. That has been powerful. We are still actively fostering, but not with like a long-term placement. We have done some short-term things, and we actually have, I got a call last night about a respite placement. So a weekend, there's a foster family that is going out of state and they can't take the child. So she's coming to stay with us for 3 days. And I really see our role as being that going forward, that we would help out, which makes me feel really good because then we can be that warm place, another adult to trust for a child who's probably not had a lot of adults they can trust in their lives. So that feels very special and an honor to be able to do that.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for sharing all of that. Marissa and Daniel, I wonder if there is any kind of artwork that speaks to you about covenant, a piece of visual art or poem or anything that you'd like to share.
Yeah, I'm a poetry person, especially at hard times in my life. I just read a lot, but when I'm going through a particularly hard time, poetry is about what I can handle. So this is actually my favorite book of poetry, Dear Mother by Bunmi Latidan. Some people know her as the author of Honest Toddler, which is like a jokey internet thing, but she writes beautiful poetry. Her latest one just came out and I'm loving it. But let me figure out where my poem is. Oh, it's right here. I had it marked. Okay. It doesn't have a title, but it says, as you grow into the person you were meant to be, remember, my love, that it's okay to slip, fall, fail, cry, lose, come in dead last. Sit this one out with your head in your hands. You can't disappoint me as you walk these slippery rocks of life, for I adored you before you knew what medals were, and applauded your heartbeat and first breath as magnificent victories. If there's one truth I want you to know, tuck in your heart and seal with my kiss, it's that I don't love you because you're perfect. I love you because you're mine.
How beautiful. That speaks so strongly of covenant. I just think of the promise of parents and of God to love us even though we're not perfect. And that's just grace. Thank you so much for sharing that. Rachel and Danny, I wonder if you have anything you'd like to share.
No, what?
Did you have
No, I don't know. No, but it was funny. Actually, sitting at dinner tonight, I looked up there. We hang up artwork all around the dining room table from the kids, and so we had already thought of the rainbow covenant earlier, and I looked up, and there were several pieces that had rainbows. I mean, I guess that's a anyway. It's just an interesting sign there too, and one of them was from one of the well, she wasn't respite, I guess.
We did an emergency
There was
placement for a little girl who came and stayed with us, and she did a rainbow bear that she drew for us, and we have that hanging in there too.
And so that, I think, because I've really enjoyed that aspect of it. Like she said, I think that may be our niche going forward. That I hadn't foreseen that with, I thought fostering as a means to adoption, but I think this will be an ongoing kind of thing for us to, it's a nice service that I had never really, now that we're here, I feel like we've come this far that, that I think it's a valuable thing to take part in. And, so yeah, I saw that today, the rainbow bear, and, just, I don't have any poetry to share with you though.
I have one
So-
proverb that I like that I think about for this, and then also just sort of Christian service in general. And is just, and I had heard this from somebody who works in the foster system, and this is sort of an inspiration that he had said, but to plant trees under whose shade you will never sit. And I think about that with the children that come here and don't stay with us, don't remain as part of our family, and hope that is helpful.
That's beautiful. I mean, when we think, all of us can think of times our lives, especially as children, were touched by the kindness of loving adults or hospitable adults. And that, particularly if they weren't our parents, those kindnesses, I don't think ever leave us. So I just can't express enough gratitude for you sharing your stories with us, and for reflecting on this idea of covenant during Lent and connecting it with your family's experience of fostering and adopting.